Welcome back to our channel, our continuing study of the book of Ruth. In this video, we're going to complete Ruth chapter 2, which obviously means we've studied much of chapter 2 as well as chapter 1 and introduced the book. This is the seventh video on the book of Ruth, and we are looking forward to walking all the way through this book. And at the end of this video, I'll kind of let you know what's going to happen next, because chapter 3 is a very unique chapter. They're all unique, but very interesting chapter. We're going to handle it a little differently. And at the end of this video, I'll kind of tell you the plan for handling the third chapter of Ruth. But we are ending Ruth chapter 2 in this video, and I want to begin by talking this way. Sometimes little things, what we think are little things, become big things. And often we don't realize they're big things until we're in the moment or even after the fact. You know, the old saying, hindsight is 20/20. We often talk about that negatively, but it's also used positively. We start to figure things out. There are times when we simply could not have seen that something quite ordinary or something that was just sort of mundane, a mundane decision, ends up changing the course and trajectory of our lives. It could be that you chose a college just because you wanted to get a certain degree, but you end up meeting your spouse there. Maybe you went to work one day like you always do, but for some reason seemingly unknown to you, the boss took notice of you that day and you were picked for a promotion or some other reward, maybe a bonus. It could be you took a class in high school that you were required to take, but for whatever reason, you just fell in love with the subject matter, and it put you on a course for your future life's work. You know, in the book of Ruth, that faithful daughter-in-law has made what seemed at first to be a very simple and really decision out of desperation, because it was one of need. She and her mother-in-law, Naomi, needed grain in order to survive. And there was a provision in the law of God that allowed foreigners and widows to glean from the edges of the field. So that's what Ruth does. It's just an ordinary, life-saving decision. And further, so far as we know, there's no real logical process in choosing the field that ended up belonging to Boaz. In fact, the Bible even states that she happened to work in that portion of his field. Chapter 2, verse 3. But as chapter 2 unfolds, it turns out that happening was going to be of immense value to Ruth's well-being and, yes, her safety. After meeting and interacting with, and yes, seeming to begin to have some feelings for Boaz, Ruth returns home. But at this point, she has no idea this man is going to play a major role in her life, other than he's providing grain for her and showing an interest in her. But as chapter 2 concludes, and we're going to read the verses in a moment, there's a realization made by Naomi that this happening has the potential to change Ruth's life, and by extension, Naomi's life also. We're going to read Ruth 2, verse 17 through the end of the chapter, which is verse 23. So she, Ruth, gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. We'll describe that in a moment. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought it and gave her what food she had left over, after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed is the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. You know, gleaning was meant to help the poor, others who struggle. We talked about that in the last video, poor, widows, foreigners, etc., and Ruth is all three. It was not meant to provide a huge amount of grain. While it was a blessing from a gracious God to care for those who struggled in society, it was basically subsistence living, maybe slightly above that. A person who gleaned would basically have enough grain to take care of needs, not wants. But sadly, because we're in the time of the judges, we could also question whether even that provision of the law was happening regularly. In times where so many people were selfish, didn't follow the ways of God, it could be easy to see how very little was left to glean, or some was even, maybe some were discouraged even to glean because of cruel landowners. We can't know that for sure, but being in the time of the judges, we can speculate that was at least possible. And further, it'd be very easy to think that some who gleaned would be more aggressive, would care little for the fellow people who are poor, especially if they're foreigners. And so it's a breath of fresh air to read about Boaz. That's true in how he took an interest in Ruth, certainly, but it's also true in how he was beloved by his workers. It seemed this was a man who followed God's law both in the letter of it and in the spirit of it. And in that way, we can picture his field being more of a safe haven for those who glean in order to survive. But even then, the work still had to be done. Even though Boaz had put things in place to keep Ruth safe, to allow her to gather grain more easily, she still actually had to do the work. And so Ruth 2:17 shows us this was a hard-working woman. And she did the work of gleaning until the evening and then took the time to beat out what she had gleaned. She would have been doing her best, and maybe in a somewhat elementary way, to separate the pure grain from the chaff so that she would take home what was usable for eating and for baking and not have the chaff, the mess in there. And though we may not realize it without some thought, the end of verse 17 is significant. We don't use ephahs for measurement, at least I don't, right? So the fact that Ruth had an ephah of grain, which by the way is a plural in the original language, that may not mean much to us. But if we were to do some calculation, an ephah is about 4 gallons, according to Leon Morris and others. So just picture a 5-gallon bucket, mostly filled, 4/5 the way filled, with tiny heads of grain. And remember, she's done the added work of beating out the grain, so there's very little, if any, chaff, which would also mean there's very little air pockets in there. 4 gallons of nearly pure grain is, to say the least, a large amount, especially for one person to bring home from one day's worth of work. One writer suggests that what she carried home likely weighed somewhere around 30 pounds. It's possible that Naomi's question in verse 19, the questions are at least in part sparked by the size of the harvest that Ruth brings home. But the grain was not all that Ruth brings home. When she came to Naomi, she had this great amount of grain, but she also had what food she had left over after being satisfied. Verse 18 tells us that. In other words, Boaz had given her of his meal, but he let her take home the leftovers. That was unheard of, and it would have made a powerful impression on Naomi. And so the imagery here is amazing. Keep in mind that Naomi has said that God has left her empty. But now, after just one day, Ruth comes home satisfied. She comes home full. She comes home filled with the blessings of God. It's no wonder that Naomi is nearly breathless in asking for details about her day. And we're introduced to a term that's so powerful, Redeemer. Naomi asks about Ruth's workday and where she got all these things and where she got them from. She's told about a man named Boaz, but there may be something subtle about how Naomi shares that information, because she says the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. Did you notice that word with? She doesn't say she had worked for. She doesn't even just say she had worked in his fields, but that she had worked with this man. Now, if we have Naomi's next 2 statements in the order in which she actually said them, and I believe we do, it would have been fascinating to see Ruth's face as Naomi spoke her first statement, because she simply burst out in praise to God. May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. That's found in verse 20. Ruth almost has to wonder why her mother-in-law would be praising God in this way when all Ruth has done was tell her what field she had worked in that day, the man's name whose field she had worked in. After all, at this point, it wouldn't seem as if much had changed. In a few days, if not the very next day, Ruth would have had to go out again and glean, and she would still be a widow, she would still be a foreigner, she'd still be poor. But then Naomi's second statement lets Ruth know why there's this praise to God. The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. Ruth didn't know that. In fact, it's possible that Ruth didn't even know about that provision in the law of Moses for such a thing. But here is Naomi letting this daughter-in-law know that God has provided some level of hope, in fact a great level of hope, through this man named Boaz. But there's something subtle and beautiful in Naomi's words. Did you notice that she doesn't call Boaz my Redeemer? She says he is one of our redeemers. Ruth is not going to be left in the dust because this man could help Naomi and Naomi's family line. Ruth is part of the family, even if she is a foreigner and only part of the family via marriage. but he's called our Redeemer. You've probably seen that Hebrew word before, G-O''E-L. I've heard it pronounced Goel and Goel, however it's correctly pronounced. It may be more easily understood, and we know that some translations call these individuals kinsman redeemers. Sometimes that's how it's translated. These were people who were in the bloodline of a family, and when a family member died, they had the right and the privilege to care for those in the family who were now destitute, who were now in a bad way, and they were to provide offspring for them as well. The word redeemer often carries with it the idea of buying one back, but this wasn't some type of slavery situation. It was really the idea of purchasing someone out of a dangerous situation and agreeing to care for that individual in a covenant relationship. This was an act of sacrifice and grace, which is what makes it such a fitting picture of Jesus as a redeemer in the New Testament. With his own blood, he buys us back from the world of sin, and he agrees to provide us all we need to live for God. Now, the author of the book of Ruth is a master writer. Every detail in this book matters. And so it's very interesting when in chapter 2, verse 21, Ruth is once again called Ruth the Moabite. It's almost as if that detail could have been lost in the previous verses because things have gone so well for her. We have to remember, though, that Ruth was a widow, but she was also a foreign widow. And as such, she may have been safe near Boaz, but because of the times in which she lived, she was probably not very safe in regular society yet. Or at least, she might have been looked on in a different way. And she seems to realize that. She reports to Naomi that a provision had been made by Boaz for Ruth to stay near his young men and to do so until the entire harvest was complete. Naomi, sensing that was a good thing, assures her to do that. But interestingly, Naomi tells Ruth to go into the fields when Boaz's young women are there, not his young men. That probably just means that she knows that others, widows and others, who are harvesting there are safe. But it is an interesting twist, isn't it? And so chapter 2 then ends with a very simple notation that Ruth worked in the fields of Boaz and continued to live with her mother-in-law. Those details will play a significant role in chapter 3, but the author gives us the detail that Ruth continued this work not just until the barley harvest was complete, but also until the wheat harvest was complete, which would have been a month or two later, maybe a hair more than that. She was taken care of throughout the entire harvest season. She continued to work through all that time, and we can imagine if she's bringing home this much grain, plenty was being put up for the remainder of the year until next year's harvest. Boaz cares for this young woman by providing for her as best he can, both in harvest and in safety. But he has obviously also some feelings for her. It's important to note he doesn't try to take advantage of Ruth. She continues to live with Naomi. Both Ruth and Boaz are keeping themselves pure and are living lives of trust in God, and God is providing in this way. Now, for the reader, this section of Scripture is exciting. There's hope, there's anticipation, there's a realization that God is providing, but can you imagine living it? Can you even begin to put yourself in the sandals of Naomi and Ruth, and also of Boaz as he sees this happening? But think about Naomi and Ruth. Can you put yourselves in their feet, their shoes? To some degree, maybe you can. Because many of us go through times when we wonder if God will work something out, and in his providence, he does. In some of those seasons of life, there's that one moment, that one conversation, that one realization that causes us to wonder, is this it? Is this how God is working this out? Typically, we can't know in the moment. But the hope and the anticipation of those times is remarkable. Remember that even though 10 years has passed in Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, all of Ruth chapter 2, except for the summary statement at the end, takes place in one day. That's how life so often works. We just do what we are doing, and then in what seems like a moment, God's providence begins to take shape. It's a reminder of his goodness, but it's a reminder also to just keep being faithful. In our next video, we're going to tackle Ruth chapter 3 in its totality, but I should have said in our next videos. Because what we're going to do is Ruth chapter 3 is a very controversial chapter. We're going to study the text itself in our next video. And then we're going to take a second video that will be much, much briefer, but talk about the different views of Ruth chapter 3. Did Ruth and Boaz do something untoward, or is this a chaste happening, a good happening in their lives? We're going to take sort of the text unfolding in the next video and then take a shorter video and sort of talk about the controversy behind it, and hopefully take an honest view of that controversy and give a balanced view of what people say and teach about that chapter, and kind of give what I believe to be the conclusion. I'm certainly not inspired by what I believe it to be, but I hope this section, Ruth chapter 2, has really lifted your hope and anticipation of what's coming. This is a great book. I love the book of Ruth, and I hope you're following along and loving it as well. And we will be back with you again very soon with Ruth chapter 3. We remind you again that we're releasing these videos on YouTube, but also we're now taking the audio and releasing them through our podcast feed at A Legacy of Faith. If you would like to subscribe to that podcast, you get things that Lee and I do, as well as the audio of these videos about Ruth, sort of weaved in and out of that as well. We hope all these things encourage you in your study of God's Word and your growth toward the Lord. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again very soon.